Esteemed friends and colleagues, good morning. I'm happy to see this intensive start of work. Andrei Makarov has entrusted me to chair this session, so I'll try to do everything in my power to make sure it will be interesting. So we are waiting for the presentation of our esteemed speakers. Well, frankly speaking, I wanted to start today by saying that today we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the tax code and tax reform. And so it's a unique session in terms of composition of panelists, which includes the key agencies, the audit chamber, some associations, the governors, so the key business units have never before got together so as to discuss this subject. We will hear Andrei Makarov's report. So let me remind those who probably don't know, this is a person who 20 years ago was one of the key authors of the first section in the tax code. So to a certain extent, it's kind of we'll be summing up the results of our work and analysis towards this anniversary. So it was not easy to start this presentation. Seriously, I'm really grateful to Andrei Makarov. I'm not dead. I'm talking about you in the present for your intellectual courage. That's what I wanted to say. History is not honored by people, is not in high respect. Many people refer to the history of reform, but some people, especially those who are young, have not reached the age of 40, probably do not remember that. But let me remind you that the collapse of the Soviet system meant the collapse of the system of state revenues, of government revenues. So those who do not understand this, let me remind you that tax was just included in the price of the goods, the price established by the state. So it was kind of a share in the salary, also established by the state. And in this sense, there was no proper tax system. So in this sense, transition to non-government prices meant a collapse of the entire taxation system. So we had to create it from scratch. So the second salient feature of that time was the weak state. The weak state, for an economist, implies that the state that cannot balance out its profits and losses and costs and revenues, if it promises to collect more taxes than it is physically capable of doing. If the police force is capable of collecting enough tax. So that's a real situation in any revolution when you have to explain to certain social circles that you will pay to them, and you have to explain to others that you're not going to take money from them. So you have to balance between these two groups. In the meantime, this is it's a federal state in the worst sense of this word. So when we had to speak with the regions, talking about who is going to transfer money and how much, so there were different kinds of negotiations. At the session yesterday, we discussed several issues, and the main result of the tax code and the political stabilization in the year 2000 was actually transition to the uniform rules of the game in terms of the tax base, and also in relations with the regions, with the country's constituent regions. And also that's actually means the extent to which the country is a federal state, not in terms of taxes, but in essence. It can be called federal, but it can be in essence federal when there is a tax competition between provinces, territories, and there's a kind of a free type of tax base formation. So that's what I wanted to say in my brief introduction, that the taxes demonstrate the efficiency of the state, its capability of living and collecting taxes, and also it demonstrates the reality of the federation, the availability and the presence of the federation. That's what we have parted with, but what we have come to now. The technological capability in recent time has changed radically. The tax agenda, not only in terms of tax collection, but also in terms of what taxation is about, has also changed radically. So in this context, we of course have to discuss the question, what is a tax system in, for example, conditions of Uberization, when major companies play as smaller companies, when more and more people increasingly become freelancers. What is a tax system in conditions of artificial intelligence? You can, of course, laugh and find it funny, but also it's also interesting how we can collect taxes in such conditions. And also, we have to consider whether we are a federal or a unitary state. We also have to answer the question how different functions have to be combined. Should taxes provide more incentives to the state economy, or just support it? So whether we have to improve the tax legislation, or shall we leave it alone and deciding that it should be as stable as possible. So I do hope that today we would be able to try, maybe even make an attempt to find the answers to these questions. So let me ask the author, one of the co-authors of the tax code, Andrei Makarov, to talk on this issue. Thank you. I'm technically absolutely illiterate, but I would like to say that so I understand that in conditions of artificial intelligence, the taxes will be paid in bitcoins. I think that's Shokhin's dream. Well, I'm just trying to engage in a lively discussion, in a debate. But let me explain a few things, first of all. Number one, this gratitude for my keynote speech, it is of course a kind of an arms twisting, because when we discussed who is going to make the keynote speech, so between Siluanov, Golikova, and Mishustin, they decided to choose the one who they are not really care about. So I'm the person they least valuable to them, so to say. That's why I'm here at this rostrum right now. And the second thing, when there were no taxes and all the country knew just one kind of tax, that was a childless tax. When a husband came home from his office and the wife asked him, I had to pay again a tax, but if I ask you how much he had to pay for the lack of children, this childless tax, you won't be able to answer this. So when a husband came home and said, once again I had to pay this childless tax, okay, so these words, when people complain about these taxes, is a normal attitude of people towards taxes and towards life. No state will ever be able to force a taxpayer to pay more than he's capable of paying. So I think that's the core idea that we have to think about. So 20 years that we have traversed right now. Why we want to talk about this? Because in December last year, President said the 2017 is the year of discussions, but in 2018 we have to make a decision to adjust the tax system so as to create a sustainable, a resilient tax system with the main task of ensuring the economic growth in compatibility, in compliance with the world growth rates. So this is really important, and quite an important point. That's precisely this work has, this sort of work has united everyone. The Minister of Finance, the tax system, some also the fractional groups, the Union of Entrepreneurs, and all other organizations that have been involved in that, and they brought certain results because there were certain laws, and they were not expecting any further movements. So we had to decide something in passing. So that because we wanted to fulfill that instruction by the president to ensure the stable growth. So we'll try to answer these questions asked by Vladimir Ma, but in fact I have more questions than answers right now. But this work has allowed us actually to understand that we have quite similar approaches, and it's quite important. But when we started working on that, our methods were entirely different. So and that's why we can outline a number of issues that we have yet to decide today. So we need to refer to that 20-year experience, because that was the period of mistakes, but in the meantime it's also meant it was the period when we had to start to create this tax system from scratch. And there were quite many mistakes on this route. So we have to analyze them so as not to repeat the same errors. So we started when there were no tax bodies, no tax office, no taxpayers, but then the first 4 sections of the tax code were enacted, and we were able to deal with at least one problem in the tax legislation. That became the key engine of the taxation system. So I'll try to outline probably the key messages so that we could discuss them at this session. So the tax legislation became the engine or the driver of the system. So the main problems were with the tax office. If you remember, there were questionnaires, opinion polls. So the tax agencies were among the most corrupt and the most hated by businesses among all state bodies. But it turned out there are quite simple means to remedy this situation. So it was enough just to shout at them by the president and stop this harassment of businesses. That's what he said. And they started to implement these procedures and relations between taxpayers and tax office. Detailed procedures were described. So the first question that we see at this point, because today we are facing a certain capability, certain things like, for example, control over goods, cashier technology, and new equipment. So that's why today the tax service has now become one of the best of the world. But I'm deeply convinced that it is probably the best in the world. And I believe that there is a kind of a radical change here. So because the taxpayers now understand that payment of taxes is a normal state, normal condition of the Russian person. But the legislation which used to be a driver is today, and as my first message, is becoming a brake, an impediment on the way for the development of the tax system. So let's try to kick around some figures because they need to be explained somehow. Well, the thing is that we've just looked into a number of changes made in the tax legislation. so you could understand about 1,000 laws, 1,000 different acts that were included in the tax code at the time. But that's not all. 2017, section number 3, 500 amendments. For example, Article 11, 3 times have been changed. Article 88 have been changed twice, and others. But if we take the most essential articles, for example, Article 21, half of the article on VAT were changed. 7 amendments were made in 2016. Well, I can mention other articles as well, but if we talk about the number of sub-points in these laws, we can see that today the tax code has virtually become not just inconvenient, but it cannot be applied by taxpayers, and even the tax office cannot trace all the changes that have taken place in that. So if we just proceed from these changes, believe me, it's an absolute nightmare indeed. On the other hand, we do have a tax code which says that there are certain tax elements that have to be established by law. So when the government cannot agree on certain elements, but they want to do something at this particular time, the law is enacted, but here is a reference to the law in accordance with the procedure established by the government. The government, for some reason, believes that if they fail to agree at the time of this law has been enacted, they would be able to do it later. But in fact, that will have nothing to do with the legislation, because these bylaws mean that the tax code will have to be rewritten, and it ceased to be a the law of direct action, a direct law. So that's number 3 that I wanted, the third point that I wanted to draw your attention to. If I ask you to give me a glass of water, Vladimir Alexandrovich, do you think it will be insulting to a certain extent? What would you say? Because my throat is a little bit dry now, because I'm probably too enthusiastic here. Now let's getting back to my points. Well, in fact, when we introduce bylaws, we have to rewrite the tax code. So if you look into the in some references in the tax code, we have 667 references. The normative acts, 844. Half of them refer to the taxation system. So they cannot be changed without the radical amendment in the law. So the tax code that we are discussing right now, in fact, has no relevance at all, because the circle of people who will be acting on the basis of this law will be determined by the government. So they are just have to be handled by the ministers. Dear colleagues, in this situation, we have to make a decision. In what way we are supposed to move further if we believe that the tax code has to be amended, has to be changed, if we believe that the situation has to be changed. Vladimir Mao has asked a question that we heard yesterday, the session devoted to the efficiency of budget spending. So they said, let's not change anything, don't touch anything. Well, in fact, the heads of certain regions, of certain provinces, they actually now siding with the businesses. Just don't touch us, please forget, and don't do anything. So we have to decide today what we are going to do. Either we have to change the situation, and then we'll have to think about adopting a new version of the tax code, or perhaps let's leave it alone. Mishustin works quite well, the tax system is okay. Do you remember Colbert? The art of taxation is like the art of peeling a goose, a maximum of furs with a minimum of shouts from the goose. That's why we can deal with this task in the current system as well.
And this is the fourth statement. When we were writing the general portion of the tax code, we wrote law that contained principles. And you remember, principle of fairness is written. Presumption of innocence, that was not in any criminal code because they believe that it's not supposed to be there. The taxpayer is responsible. And Vladimir said it doesn't function, but it does function because it's difficult to imagine what can happen in our tax system and law enforcement bodies if this principle wasn't written into the tax code. So then it acts because of the fact of its existence. But today, by the way, there is no single tax code. There is a law of the first portion and the second portion, and oftentimes they contradict each other. Then comes the question which path we should select, writing the principles and considering that today the tax authority is the engine of the tax system. Let them give, let's give to them, and the business will say then we need to change the judicial system, we need to have courts control, and the taxpayer knows that he can go to the court of law and will find protection from the state. The only thing I can answer here, the court system should be changed in both cases. I'm afraid that in this case it's not decisive argument. And the second variant is attempt to write in the tax code all possible situations. This is what we do now. We're trying to catch up. We're catching up not the problems of the tax system, but the problems of evasion, tax evasion from paying taxes. Oftentimes we solve the problem when we impose on the good faith taxpayers the responsibility for the actions of the state that cannot collect taxes from the taxpayers that are not good faith. If the bad faith taxpayer is there, we can come to him. So the question, what path we should select, and we have to solve. And this is a question of choice. It's fundamental. If we are going to really change the tax legislation, the next question is the question. I started from legislation because for me it's the topic that is close to me. Legislation is close to me. It seems that this is the question how we want to solve the problem of competitiveness of the tax system, because when we had general portion and when we adopted the first chapters of the tax code, we had absolutely competitive tax system in terms of the tax burden, in terms of the tax administration. And the next statement I want to make, I think it's number 5, that today tax system is not competitive. As to the quality of legislation, I told you, as to the tax burden, it's growing. It grows by different ways. When we talk about non-tax payments, I'd like not to get into this topic because we discuss it for eternity, but let's agree that idea to write a law about non-tax payments, this idea is similar to established 2000 indicators of efficiency of the state programs. Report the work done, but don't solve the problem. If not so-called taxpayer payments, they should be in the tax code and should be considered in the tax burden. By the way, the tax burden on business will be different from we show, because if this is the payments that don't have tax nature, say utility payments or the parking tolls, should be administered by the tax authority, should be written into the tax code. Let's separate flies from the cutlets. If it's no tax payments, it's no tax code. So we come to the 6th point. And here I'd like to admit and repent when in 1998 we wrote general about the key objective that we had, how to create the rights for regional bodies and for municipalities, but not give them any rights, because only then on the provincial level there are hundreds of taxes and nobody could compute them. And we understood if at the federal level we're not ready to solve the problem, then in the bottom is not nobody's ready. We imitated readiness. We did everything possible so all the questions should be solved at the federal level. At the end, we have 15 taxes. It was a breakthrough. It was creation of the economic space. It was attempt to keep the country as a whole integral. At the same time, we took rights away from them that are provided by the Constitution. Look at the 32nd chapter, that the local budgets form the budgets and form the taxes. So what can we do? We forbade. It's a violation of the Constitution. As for the provinces, it's the same. We took to the federal level the taxes distributed into the local and municipal budgets. When they need money, they'll take from business. Whether we right or not right, they will collect them anyway. If we don't want to solve this problem, it is necessary for us to radically change the situation. And Anton, I'd like to ask you, it's very important to have right interpretation. I'm thankful to the Ministry of Finance that supported two key ideas of the taxes. We should not establish benefits on the federal level for the local budget. Only when it was taken to the government level, there was small amendment, very small amendment to the regional and the municipal taxes. Will not have to establish anything for the local and municipal. This is their right. If we want to establish for the regional and local taxes, we should compensate all the benefits, compensate missed profits. It should be in the existing coordinate system, the federal taxes that are taken to the regional and local budgets. Otherwise, we need to change distribution of taxes as the federal, provincial, and local. How? I'm not ready to say, because I perfectly understand that the profit, objectively, distribution of the profit in the regions is the lamination of the provinces. We understand it. Try to say that we increase profit, take to the federal level, will be reaped before the end of the session. The next question that is very important, is very serious. Today we're trying, is the 6th or 7th, Tatiana, counting, it's number 7. It's good to have accounting chamber with us. Really, 7th question is, they try to impose, and I go to the tax burden, they try to impose that we need money for education and healthcare. It can be done by two ways. There are two variants. There's one alternative, whether we increase taxes or we take away from somebody and give it to the healthcare and education. But in the situation when it's difficult to find whom to reap, there's only one way to increase tax burden. By the way, I wanted to point out that the authors of such ideas that say that we need to spend money for education and healthcare, no one will be arguing. They refer to the public surveys. And the question is, are you ready to pay extra taxes that you know that this money will be taken for the healthcare and education? People really answer yes. It would be more fair if these surveys formulated, are you ready to pay additional taxes that will be taken for healthcare and education, but you will certainly know that the costs of education and healthcare will be at the same level that they are today, because no proposals on how to really to improve the quality by giving money, there's not any suggestion. We're trying to solve the problems by amount of money. So this argument, the cutoff point, $40 or $45, in my point of view, absolutely artificial, because we cannot efficiently spend funds that have at the cut-off point at 40 if we spend efficiently the same way as we do it with the 45. If we talk about efficiency on money spending, we say we need more money. In such a way, it seems to me that really opportunity to have funds can be done in three ways. The first, it's obviously efficiency of spending that of the funds that we have. Tatiana yesterday said it yesterday. I will not repeat. And there are opportunities that are great. Second, opportunity to administer. I'd like to give you an example. The opportunity to administer, even this example about the fur coats. And everyone said when we started work on the fur coats before the tagging, turnover was 7 billion. When we introduced the tagging of the fur coats, it was 6 billions. Taxes will not increase because people understand the risk to go to the shade. It's the risk of prison. It's easier to enter the legal space. You have to set one gasket. It's the question about small business. The small business is dealing with the fur coats. So we made a gasket, and the turnover increased at 1 degree. Taxes increased by 100 million. It's the question about the quality of the tax system, but opportunities of the tax administration to have extra revenue, they're not unlimited like Anton Silvanov thinks. Mikhail Vladimirovich, I looked at Mishustin and understood that you think this way too. And finally, the third, maybe we can agree that if we need money for education and healthcare, we will send money in priority way that we can have in addition, not from the growth of the tax burden, but through the growth of economics. If we believe that economy is growing, we have additional funds. We have additional money because the Mishustin's work takes people from the shadow who didn't pay taxes in the past. It seems that the tax burden is growing, but it is spreading more evenly, and there is huge reserve there. Mikhail Vladimirovich, am I wrong if I say that we have additional 1% from the GDP, even higher? They say we need 2% of the GDP. For the last year, only through the improvement of administration, we have more than 1%. Really, we don't believe that we can be more efficient and have extra money in our disposal. So the eighth statement. Excluded is the increase of the tax burden, even more so talking about increase of the tax burden. It's not exclusion, but in the near future, when the new opportunities come, the state must declare about adherence to decrease of the tax burden. If we compare our tax burden not with the countries or OSR and G20, but countries that surround us, with whom we compete at the capital markets, and the labor resources compete. We have and the flow of money to the Kazakhstan territory. Whether we stop it, I'd like to go to the ninth statement, because we understand perfectly that in the globalization situation, every country will offer proprietary ways of attraction of funds. Look at Americans. They have their own personal revenue and the profit tax. We understand the key advantage of the American economy is the safety of American investments in the different countries. They say, come to us, invest from us. It's delirium if they want to develop production. They say that you can make your investments safe coming to us. But forget about Americans. I never liked them anyways. Let's think how we want to compete with our nearest neighbors. Let's think how we compete with the countries of BRICS. let's think how we will win in the competitive fight with those when we have really competitive fight. In this way, we must in the future show not increase of the tax burden, but decrease of the tax burden. Right away, I'd like to say, here is another question. Look, they say, can we increase taxes? The first problem for the businesses. Understand that people may not agree. I'm finishing, Anton Germanovich. Practically, I'll tell you where to take money. Understand that it's discussion. I will not say 22 or other numbers. I remember that one political party suggested 15, 15, 15. Always stated that for me, when I was younger, I like 1960, 90. But the problem is that the key load burden on business is the payroll tax. If we take the average, I understand that the head of Delaware, I see, listen to the second part of the phrase. What's the problem? 1666 is the rate of the burden on the companies when we look at the global experience. Payroll load is 2 times more. Whether we're not competitive in terms of this indicator is quite obvious. Then the compensation, the world goes to the increase of indirect taxation. We perfectly understand this is not only the VAT question, not so much of VAT. If we talk about VAT, the first thing, we should not talk about 10% socially important goods, but we understand that the burden is distributed in different ways, and we talk about increase of the indirect taxation through VAT. These are the same revenues that can be redistributed with consideration of the industries which will suffer. So no way by itself increase of VAT or indirect taxation cannot be considered as the argument that is not decisive. Yet the consumption tax absolutely necessary. Point 10, just like Tatiana said, I will not take her breath away from her. We have unique experience when uniform social tax, social charges, administration of the social payments, we walk to and fro. I think we have enough experience to show it. Administration of tax for all charges, like I said, don't have tax nature, is mandatory. I think very big optimist today from the social bloc of the government can talk about insurance nature of the insurance charges. Optimism is great, by the way, I'm not against, but it's quite obvious that no pension, no medical insurance, social insurance, there's something about insurance, but this is not the reason. It's pure tax burden. We should think how Tatiana Alexeyevna offered to save funds at the state level. Maybe we should admit that they have uniform social tax. The uniform social tax, and retirees will know tomorrow that the state is responsible for the pension they have. They'll not compute the scores. If we ask who can compute the pension, I'm afraid that people will not raise hands. We objectively today have a system that is related to the accrual of pension. Absolutely no one can understand, but considering that we have the same cost of these pension scores, factually they equalize the insurance nature of its existence, and high technology companies assume the burden of today's payments to the pensioners. It cannot continue. But the key summary that we have to make, we can make any variance, we can modify Bismarck of the middle of 19th century how we like it. Bismarck is practically doesn't care practically, But until we admit that without participation of the person in the tax insurance,
образом отражено в налоговой.
This has to be reflected in the tax system one way or another. Dear colleagues, I just wanted to draw your attention to several questions. So, talking about supplementary budget revenues, do you remember these shouts about trade sales tax in Moscow, that a lot of letters that I was trying to stifle the small businesses in Chelyabinsk and in other cities. But the sales tax in Moscow showed quite a different thing. It wasn't a fiscal payment. It was needed by the legal businesses. Moscow receives about 12 billion rubles thanks to this tax. 12 billion rubles per year. But this is what has been paid by those who had not paid before. Why we decided to do that? Because we are afraid to say that that was the issue that is so important to the entire country. We are talking about the so-called spa tax for resort towns. This practice has been all over the world. Tourist tax. Berlin, they charge 5%. 5% in Berlin, you pay tax in hotels for hotel accommodation. In Hamburg, 1.27 euro. In Rome, a little bit less. But why millions upon millions of foreign tourists do not pay, who stay here for many days? Why they don't pay taxes? What about internet trade by foreign companies? In 2017, we lost about 330 billion rubles. If we continue along the same routes, we will lose trillions by 2020. It will be a real blow, a real attack on business. As Karl Marx once said, the practice is the criterion of the knowledge. Do you remember the internet tax, all these debates about that? Have we increased the internet tax? No, we haven't increased the internet tax. What we are afraid of. So we have to explain to people what exactly we want to achieve, what kind of results we would like to see, and most importantly, what exactly we are expecting from them. Because in fact, no one will be able to cancel a few things, such as the stability of the tax system, just as the stability of the pension system is the confidence, trust to people. So one of the key questions is how to return this trust in us, which was not there. So let's sum up this. The question put by Vladimir Mao. Let's leave everything alone. Let's leave it like this. Let's work it like this. Thank you. Thank you, Andrei Mikhailovich. We'll try to trigger a discussion, so I will ask questions which have not been agreed with the participants. I have a right to ask a question. You have a right not to answer these questions, but you may answer just the questions that you believe to be most important to you. So I'm going to talk about the things that seem quite interesting to me, but if you think that there are other things which are more interesting, please consider it neutral. But I would like to ask all people who are going to speak here to answer just one question. So what I mean is there's a kind of a long, protracted debate. So some people say that we have an enormous tax burden. It's too high. Other people say that it's normal, not low, but it's quite standard. You can calculate it in different ways. You can compare with other countries, if we can, with Kazakhstan or with Europe. So of course, then the results will be quite different, will vary. But the tax burden is just, it's a kind of a feeling. It's a perception. So the most important question is whether we would be able to live, to survive in conditions of such taxes and to invest. So in your opinion, just as the managers, as the state, civil servants, do you think that it's a high or low or standard tax burden? So let's venture this discussion. My question is to Anton Siluanov. I have two groups of questions indeed. So in fact, the increasing tax burden, can we do without that? We're not talking about 10 years, like during the next 3 to 5 years. Can we alleviate it, or can we increase? I am not asking you whether we're going to increase tax. And the second group of questions, since the president has initiated a new type of amnesty of capitals, when it is going to be implemented, proceeding from the last message of Andrei Makarov, amnesty is not the key thing, but the trust is the most important. Well, of course, if you legalize your revenues, your profits, that means that that doesn't mean that you won't be persecuted for something else, but its amnesty is less important than trust. So please, Anton Siluanov, if you think there are more important things, let me answer the questions that you asked me. As for the tax burden, I have this chart here that I was sure that you will be ask me this question, because at all these tax debates, this always a subject in the center of attention. So if you look at the level of tax levied that we saw in 2017, 30.8% of GDP. Last year it was 29.2% of GDP. It's a fiscal burden. So talking about all budget system, it's about 27%. Last year 32%. Whether it's high or low, without oil and gas, by the way, just for your reference, is 24.4%. That was the fiscal tax burden. Whether it's high or low, well, if we compare with the European countries, it's not high. Comparing with Asian countries, it's slightly higher as compared to those countries. But the question is a little bit rhetorical. Why we need taxes? So as to finance state expenses, right? It's quite obvious. But of course, we should not overdo here, because it's kind of a contract with the society that usually has to be signed, how much a taxpayer is prepared to pay. So we understand this point, but the fact that our country has a nuclear potential and our country needs additional revenues, additional money, also the pension system, social benefits, even more than in the Soviet Union. It's quite high social responsibility. The nuclear potential, the military forces that do not exist in many Asian countries, and there is no such social support in these countries. So considering this, we need all this money to finance all these expenses. That is why we have to consider this tax burden from two angles. On the one hand, it's our treasury, our resources. On the other hand, this is a kind of a position in incentivizing and creating the investment climate for many people, whether to invest in Russia, whether to develop production here, or maybe they should use their money and use their investment in other jurisdictions. So this is also an important question. So answering your question, what can we do with this tax burden? Well, of course, it's quite natural. We in the government do not do not intend to increase the tax burden in the years to come. So this is quite important. So right now, the taxes levied have increased. Right now, in recent times. So slightly, well, excise tax has increased somewhat to a certain percentage points, which is, but we have managed to increase the tax collection due to the better system of tax collection. That's it, up to 1 trillion rubles. The VAT, first of all, we've also improved the tax collection on the uniform social tax. Also, we see the overall tax collection. Tax revenues have increased in general. So our task is to reduce the so-called shadow economies sector, and well, talking about those taxpayers who ignore our tax legislation, that's where we have to find resources to finance our expenditures. And our expenditures imply the infrastructure that ensures our growth, also investment in human capital. That is why this kind of maneuver, the internal expenditures, changes in the structure of the tax system, we have to do something about that. So we see certain problems here. Andrei Makarov referred to this as quite high burden on businesses in terms of direct expenses. The payroll tax, first of all, salary tax, 30% of different social tax, insurance tax. So, well, of course, so we are actually, it is much lower as compared to other countries. If you open your own production, your own business, if you pay salaries, so immediately quite a large amount of your resources will have to be paid in the form of taxes. Well, of course, we have much to do here, optimizing the tax system, making it more competitive in this particular context, redistributing the structure of taxation, alleviating tax burden on labor, I mean the payroll tax. So answering this question, I would like to say, first of all, that we are not intending to increase tax burden. Number two, we're going to change the structure of the tax system, making it more competitive. And number three, we're going to transform the tax system so that it could deal with the main task facing Russia today, increasing the economic growth rates. Also, the tax system should be as simple and as comprehensible as possible, making sure that there is no shadow sector in the economy. The tax system will be more high-tech because due to administration methods and new administration methods, we will get new resources. And so special thanks to Mikhail Mishustin. So we are acting jointly with the customs system. So we are trying to renovate our risk management system, the traceability of taxes in the customs service, a new cash registration system. So in any case, that's our future, and in our future implies the increase in the state revenues without increasing the tax burden on businesses that pay taxes. We see today there's quite a great number of taxpayers are acting in the shade, so to say, and that's our task, how to get them out of there. Now about the amnesty. It's true, there was an amnesty of capitals in 2016, and I quite agree with the previous speaker that it's a question of trust. 200,000 tax returns were collected during the amnesty period. Well, of course, we count on much more. But the question of trust, whether it was information about our registered companies, will leak into the mass media, and our law enforcement bodies will start doing something about this. But nothing like that happened, and actually we are right now the second stage of this amnesty campaign that was announced by the president, and precisely what he said, dear entrepreneurs, dear businessmen, we've already scored some quite positive experience in this effort, and we have very good positive results indeed. We do face certain problems with our businesses abroad, so please transfer your capitals here, declare, and please work in Russia. So amnesty will continue this year, from March until December 2018. We will be offering virtually the same terms and conditions to businesses for the amnesty of their capitals, and we also agreed that that all accounts, not only open accounts but also closed accounts, as at the 1st of March, will also be under the amnesty terms and conditions, and we will be explaining how to act in this case. We've also, in accordance with the President's decision, we've also planning to release the profit, the income tax, to exempt those companies that have been registered abroad from income tax. So that means the tax return, the conditions, the capital return to Russia. We do hope that these resources will be returning to Russia and will be working here for the good of our country. Thank you very much. Can we ask Alexei Reprik to give his feedback, because Alexei Reprik representing medium business here, so that's we are interested in your feedback and your reaction to that. So I would like to remind you, it's a kind of a general question. So your expectations from the tax burden. Well, let me reflect on that, on the keynote presentation, on the comments made later, especially the first part. Well, in fact, these great four businesses, the industrial associations that appeared recently, now they are virtually non-existent right now. Those who managed to register its place and manages to be in the same echelon, I would say there are very few such companies, unfortunately. But what I would like to say, that first of all, there are quite a few things that mentioned by Andrei Makarov have already been, so we've gone through this already. We've already experienced that. So we're talking about these incessant tax changes that goes through the State Duma. Now, all this takes place with the active involvement of the business community. So, in fact, when we talk about this, and when we share our opinions, even when we were at the starting position, we either start to believe in Andrei Makarov's position, or Andrei Makarov begins to look at this situation in a slightly different manner. Of course, the level of charisma of the chairman of the committee should not be doubted. Everybody is aware of that. So, number one issue that I wanted to share with you, I quite agree that administration of taxes is the key to receive additional budget revenues, and that's actually quite much that has been done here, and many of those efforts were successful. But I believe that a lot of these things will lead only I'm not talking about increasing the tax burden, but I do hope that they will somehow alleviate, will reduce the tax burden for many companies. But I share in Andrei Makarov's position regarding these decisions and these questions that most people have agreed on, that education, healthcare, of course, they do not have enough, and of course they do not receive a large share of taxes. But first, you should find a way how to manage these sectors of the economy more efficiently. So I understand there were certain attempts made, especially in the Ministry of Education. I mean the elaboration of standards, but they have not completed this work, and I think I understand that's quite a serious limitation, and without the serious state guarantees, they won't be able to go ahead.
The normal business must run not after the benefits to get some extra benefits for certain tax or slightly more of some other benefit. Things should be equal. At the same time, if the way of cutting the benefits or denial of benefits, such as the VAT for the foods, for the healthcare, will be targeted, it will be addressing concrete needy entities, it will be better, it will be more fair. At the same time, it will make our system more equal, uniform. So uniform sometimes is good. As for the non-tax payments, anything that is tax is in tax code. Anything that is not tax should be also fixed by the code. Before, not to go into the detail, I have something that worries me is the question of trust. I heard it from Andrei and Anton. There are several things that, in my view, that can correct the system. For instance, you talk about presumption of innocence. It's in the code. Why it's there? Because when at the end of a certain situation, Federal Tax Service and Federal Customs Service or some other agency such as Federal Antitrust Service or somebody else, they say your business was wrong, the customs value was decreased artificially. It seems to us this way. In order to make business, for some reason, to agree with this, what happens? There is a transfer of the composition from the regulator to tax enforcer, and tax enforcer suggests the director to think in more comfortable situation how wrong he was. But we think seriously, if it's possible, we go and admit the guilt. I think that one of the instruments that can increase the trust, this is gone away from necessity to admit the guilt, go away from necessity to agree with something we don't agree. At the same time, by mitigating the risks for the budget. I perfectly understand that today, when the transplanting, not teleportation of non-successful financial managers doesn't leave the pages of the newspapers because they are teleported from the big damages to the taxpayers and for the citizens. Everyone is afraid that the taxes are not paid fully. They will not get into the budget. Everyone is afraid of state losing the money. What seems to be rational, if there is a question looked at by the state and by the business differently, let's make LC system in the treasury. Can be questioned some. Let's sit and wait. What will Russian court says? What is the risk for the budget if it's zero in this context, in case if the court is on the side of the regulator and explains that business wrongly interpreted, everything goes to the budget without admission of guilt, and the law enforcement organizations become element of conviction. The quality of administration dramatically grew. At the same time, provincial stories, they have excesses. You know, let's say it this way, I think that majority's perception of the situation. We try at the level of the business associations to tell the regional members that maybe they interpret certain things slightly partially because their position has color. If we create more mechanisms that guarantee the views that the business trusts and not afraid, more opportunities we have to avoid situation when the sufferer drags that another one who is not sufferer. So when we talk together with the representatives of the state, a social contract will be perceived as the fair contract from the state point of view and from the business point of view. Thank you very much. Tatiana Alexeyevna, naturally, I don't want to be original. Please continue. Yesterday conversation about social funds merger. And what Andrei said, that majority of what we believe is the tax payments, is insurance payments. In my understanding, pension system is the liability of the state. It's not accumulation of the funds, but the liability of the budget before the pensioners. How does it function? I'd like to ask you to continue this theme, plus maybe touch upon the subject of administration. What administrative implications? Thank you. Dear colleagues, at first I'd like to say about the question of the tax burden, and I'd like to say that here there is obvious principle of fiscal neutrality. Why? Because if we compare today's tax burden collected and the potential of collectability, it's not exhausted yet. And here substantial role is played not by the tax legislation and the rates and the rules established by it, but neighboring legislation. That is the foundation for collection of taxes according to the rules that were established by the code. First of all, it has to do with the property tax and real estate taxes. We see a big number of the land plots and the real property that are not registered, and so the taxes cannot be collected from them. So this is the losses for the budget system, and first of all, of the consolidated budgets of the subjects of the Russian Federation. So we have not to change the tax system, but we have to change system of registration and approaches to the system. The second topic that was on the agenda to a greater extent has to do with federal budget. And we discussed it, but discussion didn't finish. It drags its feet. And there was a statement of Andrei Mikhailovich and Anton Germanovich. It's legislation about insurance charges. When we decided about the return of the administration of pension charges, we had big problems with the formed indebtedness of the insurance payments that should not be indebtedness with better administration, but the volume of the charges to the medical insurance and pension insurance, and we decrease the dependence of the system from the federal budget and the budgets of the subjects of the Russian Federation. At the same time, we have to say that today's situation is this part of the indebtedness of the tax service should part with this because it's bad debt, but the colleagues undertake certain efforts that believe that the hopeless indebtedness can be administered and can be collectible in the near period of time. And the search for the right ratio between tax system and the other legislation, it's also a problem that cannot be forgotten. The second, what I want to refer, this is what Andrei Mikhailovich said. What should be done with the tax legislation? Should it be changed radically? Or we need some pointed amendments, just like it was done in the previous period, before making decision on how to change tax legislation and how to codify it. If we talk about long-term future, and if we want to determine this legislation, the ratio of direct and indirect taxes, we should understand for ourselves what is the structure of economics we build and what jobs we create. If we talk about digitalization and robotization of economy, we understand that we create higher productive workplaces with higher salary. At the same time, we have to realize that it's a cut jobs in the industry and outflow to the service industry. So in the service industry, we have lesser salaries, and as the rule, not full-time employment. The share of the payroll, because payroll is less, and the share of the payroll in the GDP is less. We have to ask question, well, in principle, who is responsible for paying taxes? Not insurance payments. Who should carry the burden, employee and employer, or only employer? But here we face with the situation. We have today big shadow employment, 14 million people according to the official data from Rosstat. According to other sources, it's more, and attempts, we have to admit that attempts to legalize individual employment didn't come to fruition. In the tax system, only 813 people were registered in the tax service. So people don't believe in the tax changes, or don't believe in this period of 2 years. They believe it's too little. Going back to the payroll tax, the burden on the payroll in other countries less than in the Russian Federation. But this is not quite so. There are different countries with different burdens. We have to understand that burden on the payroll depends on the structure. I already said, who is paying? Employee and employer, or only employer is paying? In our situation with the employer, we have very low salary. So budget sector is overblown, that cannot pay additional taxes on payroll, providing its future pension, or the future welfare, or the compulsory medical insurance charges. I hear the position of Andrei Mikhailovich that it is necessary to discuss the question about going back to the uniform social tax as the non-returnable payment, because truly it's so, and the score system dumped insurance nature of the social insurance system. It has not become clear for majority of the population. Even more so today, I watched certain TV show, especially good for today. The people try to explain how to determine the pension score. In response on how it's determined, the correspondent asked another question. Self-employed people will not have pension at all because they don't pay and nothing is happening to them. Unfortunately, eligible answer was not given. It means that the population and the experts have no concept. What do we create? What system in the social insurance we build? And what should be the burden on the payroll that is paid by the employer, whether employee should participate in the formation of his future pension claims. I'd like to draw attention to something. Not many people look at this law, but it exists. It's the conceptual law. It's called about the basics of the social insurance. It's not pension. It's not healthcare or social insurance. It's the basic law that determines the principles of social insurance. If today we are ready to come back to discussion of the conceptual principles of the social insurance, we first should do this. And then we should answer a number of other questions. Andrei Mikhailovich said that maybe employee will co-pay to the tax system. So there's a big question whether he will make co-payments, because he doesn't understand how much employer is paying and what will be the parity. Minister of Finance said, he hinted, it would be nice to decrease taxes, not to decrease the social insurance charges. Then the budget will have to pay. If the budget pays, then what is the target for the pension provisioning we should establish, such as 2.5 surviving level, or like the world does, or the 102 convention of Global Labor Organization. In this way, we have to determine and answer this question. And finally, the third, we should not forget that we have compulsory medical insurance. And insurer of the non-working population are subjects of the Russian Federation. Moving the charges to the taxes, we have to answer the question, who are the subjects of the Russian Federation? In relation to non-working population, are the insurers, or they should pay tax on providing the system of the health care, and how much this tax will be. I give you such examples not to refuse to work with the direct taxes. On the opposite, seems to me that the future is that we'll have parity rights of the employer and employee, but we have to very delicately address the system, because it's very sensitive, not only for employee and for our pensioners. It is sensitive for all economy in general. Finally, I must say, by the way, Vladimir Alexandrovich, it doesn't cancel my arguments and the proposal I made. If we decide what to do and start discussion of the single fund, then I'll allow to slightly disclose. Mishustin today administers taxes. Slightly, some time will go and pass, and after several months, without any tension, we can easily combine the personal revenue and insurance charges. We'll have orientation, how many people paying and how many people don't pay, whether it's 14 million, but portion of this 14 million people, we will be able to see. The second point, if they pose as administrators and the quality administrators and are capable to conduct personal accounting, nothing prevents them to become responsible for the personal accounting. And the funds, there can be a link in the system of social insurance that would divide these volumes into pension, social, and medical insurance. We have paradoxes. The doctor's reference have nothing to do with medical insurance, and they don't correspond with each other just because the information systems are not integrated amongst themselves. This topic can be continued, but there are many effects from the economics and the structural organization of the system. And final, we're not saying anything about the provinces. I hope that the governors will say, but let's not forget that today in relation to the existing tax system, the subordinate classical federalism is not in the expenses. Decisions that we made and that we plan to make to the tax system in the future should not refuse to do things that we agreed upon. If we say that we conducted contract with the subsidized provinces, and as the term we said that they have to increase tax and non-tax revenues, and the last year and for this year and for the next year as the condition of restructuring, if we start pushing rearrangement of the tax system, the provinces will not be able to prove that they achieved the goal, that they seriously progressed in this area.
Culture.
Andrei Makarov has rightly noted these two keys were used on the level of constituent subjects and municipalities, but we cannot interfere with municipalities. But these are our relations with the constituent subjects of the Federation. So in the conditions of global restructuring and rejuvenation of regional budgets for 7 or 10 years, we have to take into account all our proposals on the taxation system. Thank you very much. Received quite fair criticism from many colleagues. Well, probably will lack some polemics, some debates. So I suggest that you ask your questions more actively, more enthusiastically. The next question to Stanislav Voskresensky, who combines an experience of the federal civil servant and now the governor. Acting governor, okay, major regional manager. May I ask you, if you allow me, is there a kind of double personality now? So would you like to consider something to changes as a minister or as a government, not to change anything? You have 3 minutes. First of all, I have noticed Sergei Shatalov among the audience. He's quite modest. Let's applaud him because his role, he played a major role in our tax system. The second point I wanted to focus on right here, so your feelings about the tax burden, but I would like to rely rather on perceptions and feelings on the actual facts. Talking about the number of tax returns, notices, and different documents in different territories is too high. So some people believe that the tax system is quite fair and is acceptable, but the other portion of the society believes it is not. So you talked quite much about trust. I share in these views with Andrei Makarov and with Alexei Repik. Right now, our region is not an oil region, so we are fighting for every ruble of investment. We will not levy movable property tax. So we treat every investor with caution. We treat every investor very favorably, and we would like to invite as many investors as possible in our region. But in fact, we moved away from Andrei Makarov's presentation, where he put some fundamental questions. It's quite important because we are on the crossroads right now, whether we should touch the tax system or leave it alone. Don't touch it. So it's a global issue, of course, very important question. There are 10 questions that put by Andrei Makarov that have accumulated over the last years of tax system construction. So we do have the right to ask these questions and to answer these questions. But let me add another crossroad issue regarding whether to touch it or not. So 10 years ago, such a question would have been accepted by majority of people as heresy or lacking sense. But since that time, many changes have happened in the world, have taken place, and in every sector of the economy, industry, the growing trend is individualization. I mean, not producing goods for an abstract consumer, but for a specific person. So everyone is trying to drive home something to a concrete person, to a personality, producing drugs or medications or something else or some other goods. So I'm sure this question will be discussed in social networks. So I mean that the serious tax system that is going to be on the crossroads, it has to be restructured towards a more individual approach, towards a more personal approach. Whether you call it contributions, insurance contributions, or collections, but other things, we do see certain discrepancies here. By the way, I would like to mention a few developed nations, they were already following this way. So the payments of a specific household depends on how many children, whether as a working wife there, and so on and so forth. So little by little, the world is moving in this direction. I'm not saying that we have to change everything immediately, but that's a kind of a question we have to think about this. Well, of course, we have to think about this thesis that everyone is equal, where everyone has equal rights, and so on and so forth. So we have to think, give it a thorough thought. And I'm more conservative in this sense because I would like to say that the tax system has built up like this, and there's a portion of the society is not content, is not satisfied with that, but we should understand whether we are technologically prepared to deal with this system and whether we are ready to take it into account the technological development, or whether we are ready not to change everything during the next 5 or 6 years. Tatiana Golikova just mentioned that only in April they will be able to combine certain systems, and then SCAR 2 will be added to that system, and then the tax system will have to form a file on every taxpayer and so on and so forth. So there will be ever more data, more information on the economy. So perhaps we need some kind of a more serious decision, as a more serious decisions on changes in the tax system should be postponed when the country will be more prepared technologically for that. And there will be more consensus on that issue. Thank you very much, Mikhail Vladimirovich. There's, such a notion as the boy for beating. There's such, we know of such thing, but we know that the tax, everybody says that the tax system is something that we should be proud of. But my question is, are there anything that you want to improve? Are there any things that you would like to improve? Or the things that you're not satisfied with? So there's a separate system with physical persons, with taxpayers as physical persons. Is there a chance that this, which is quite easy, 500,000 of legal entities are now using their personal accounts, web accounts. So when we are praised, I'm a little bit scared, indeed. But the thing is that they started to praise us, to say praises to us only a few years ago. But until that time, when we laid the foundations of our system, and of course it was a result of the combined action of the Ministry of Finance, our Duma, Tatiana Golikova is looking at me, despite the fact that she's a professional audit chamber, but also she has an expert knowledge also in what we are doing here. All of us love each other here, we like each other, so don't be upset about that. So now talking about a specific discontent with the internal tax system actions, well, of course, that's our main most painful subject, the source of data about the real estate objects, the law objects, and so on and so forth. But I would like to talk about economy a little bit more. Stanislav Voskresensky has just mentioned quite important things. Individualization, individual approach that we have witnessed in the world across many companies and giant companies. It is now a real need of facing the state bodies. So we're talking about the companies, this digital thing, the digital trace left by every person or a company or any object today. There are quite different requirements imposed on the state bodies that are supposed to deal with that. Initially, we in the Ministry of Finance, we treated administration as a major technological project. So the quality of the initial accounting is a real big problem. I once listened to your lecture on the radio, on Mayak radio, when you were saying that the main catalyst of economic growth is the digital or breakthrough technologies that we have yet to understand. But I would like to say that in the work which is titled The Mystery of Capital, de Soto, and a Canadian economist was saying that the situation that has obtained in the some developing countries of the world, unlike in the developed nations, implies that the real estate objects have not been registered properly. And the catalyst for GDP increase is the digital technologies which organize this work in major companies in a different way, like Facebook or Google and so on and so forth. They do not have the proper assets, but due to the right approach to these digital tools, they have built up their economy and their efficiency. So we are witness this fight for individualization, so as to approach the taxpayer and to be as inconspicuous as possible. That's what we're doing right now, and that was what Andrei Makarov was saying, whether we should change something or not change, not touch it. Of course, we have to change something. We have to rethink, of course, what these breakthrough technologies will give us, but so there were two parts: to change the tax code or to change the taxation system, or both. Now, as for the tax system, first of all, we need to understand the law enforcement. What exactly is going to happen? And then we have to think about whether we should change the taxation system. But we have to be very careful about that. There are 4 or 5 major technologies in the world today. The artificial intelligence, big data, blockchain. These are not just fashionable words, but these are the new technologies that will force the state to turn facing its citizens. So we do have certain good initial structures that will help us to build a new system of taxation system and to become a new tool of trust between the taxpayer and the state, and we'll manage that using our joint efforts. Thank you very much. Alexander Shokhin, what do you think about all that? First of all, a special thanks to Andrei Makarov for his splendid presentation, cum lecture, which lasted about 45 minutes. I think probably the Academy helped you to stick to the schedule. So on the 5th of April, February, we'll have the tax conference. So I'm sure that you will have to choose the key points from this 11 points so as to discuss these things with businesses. Just one. It's not to your credit, but our shortcoming. I think that's what we have yet to do. That's one of the 11 points that I quite agree with you. As for others, we understand from this discussion there's a serious subject for discussion, of course. But answering the key question whether we should change anything or don't touch it or not touch it, so I would subscribe to the viewpoint that since everything is changing so fast, all this digital economy and so on and so forth, so I would like to using the examples about Uberization, for example, I would like to suggest the term Shuberization that can be used in the taxation system. Well, in reality, Stanislav Sergeyevich and Mikhail Vladimirovich were talking about this. The technology of relations between taxpayers and tax administrators is changing so fast using all these technological platforms that quite many things will become more comprehensible when they are fully combined, including the subjects of law that will join the system. So I think the readjustment of the tax system that President Putin urged us to do a couple of years ago is truly is not only readjustment of certain things that have to be enacted. It has to be done with the help of our legislation. We've been working quite we've been quite busy in some working groups in terms of administration and discussion of these things with the businesses, and it was adopted in the first reading, by the way, so we've done quite a lot so as to improve the tax administration and to get a more steady growth, steady tax collection due to better administration. Also, I would like to say that 1% of this additional GDP growth, businesses understand that this additional tax collection from those levied on those who were in the shade until now, they still registered an increase in the tax burden, in the fiscal burden. And so this increase in the tax burden is proceeds through the so-called non-tax payments, the public payments, mandatory payments, either whereas they still have kind of a fiscal character. That is why, in fact, the most important conclusion from this session today is that we have to embark on a general, elaborate a general opinion that while not increasing the fiscal burden, using the Andrei Makarov's message preached by him that additional revenues is a reserve to reduce the fiscal burdens. I think that should be the main criteria behind all actions in the area of taxation, in all adjacent types of legislation, such as the law on non-tax payments, for example. Talking about this law, there are different opinions. Our companies want it to be a separate law written in accordance with the tax code provisions, except for certain measures against violations of tax law. But if it's going to be a framework act in accordance with the formula mentioned by Andrei Makarov, that's going to be under the jurisdiction of the government. The businesses need a direct action law, and that's how it can be produced, with the exception of those things that I've just mentioned. So one of the key problems is this list of non-tax payments, which have taxes and carry, and businesses accept them as a real fiscal burden. So we need to go ahead quite fast about that, and nevertheless, I think Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economy, and the State Duma should find a kind of a compromise. They should find a compromise that under which they would be able to create it, to write it as a direct law. taking into account, of course, these kind of penalties for business for violators of the tax code.
It seems to me, though, that it's absolutely correct position taken by Tatiana, delicate approach to the social funds, to the social payments. It's not so difficult to create unified entity, rather difficult to determine with each kind of the insurance payments and the nature thereof. Like FSS has insurance character, but not all of them. Portion can be given to the social insurance fund and built according to the German Bismarck model, can be managed by the social partners, the employers, and the trade unions can be, and the payments can have strict insurance character. The pension system, to solve the question of the unified tax without determining basic principle of the functioning of the pension system, it would be perhaps wrong. But what worries me the most, that all novelty in going back to the big tax manure that Anton Germanovich hinted about, they should be made very quickly, since 19 March till the end of the spring session of the State Duma. It means, colleagues, that we and expert community and business community will be excluded from the process of decision making. We have no time. Will be excited or not excited. 22 will be different pension system and so on. Anton Germanovich naturally will want to make budget for the next 3 years and for the 19th year based on the renewed principles of the tax system. So they should be determined by the spring session. Otherwise, we'll live in a situation when the tax laws are adopted in October and November. And as they say, factually, we'll start from the fresh page. Our business activity will be started from the fresh start for the next financial year. Chairman of the Budget and Taxes, when will it happen? Can you answer this question? Why always blame me? I'd like to react to what Alexander said. He said that Anton Germanovich will want to have budget of the 19th year. I want to console you. And the one court case when the cassation judge listened to the defense counselor. Your Honor, I haven't finished my presentation and you write the decision. And he answers, don't worry, Mr. Counselor, this is decision for the next case. So don't worry, the budget is being formed already. So it's about trust and predictability and not increase of the fiscal burden. Maxim Gennadievich, you elected as the governor. So the Perm is big province with resources. Among economists, there is an old argument whether you have tax competition between regions, the taxes should be neutral or not. Stanislav raised the issue of the tax competition in terms of the tax on the movable property. I am ready to participate in the tax competition. I understand that this is a very narrow sphere when the regions can have competition in taxes. Is the significant problem for development of your province? Talking about tax competition of the regions, of course we feel it. It's there, despite of the fact that there is general legislation. However, the sphere for the tax competition of the province is there. With the special investment contracts, the mechanisms when the regions have different rights to give out the benefit. The first, on the part of business, I'd like to mention a few things. First of them, from the standpoint of the taxation of the payroll, would do development of the digital economy. I'll agree with Anton Germanovich that from this standpoint, a system of taxation is non-competitive. Taxation of the payroll in the neighboring countries in the Eastern Europe, in Baltics, it was Andrean also said something. This topic is very sensitive, and a highly productive workplaces gradually flee. If we don't make system flexible, the process will accelerate. This is the place where we should apply force. The second point I'd like to make has to do with the whitening of the economy. Mikhail Vladimirovich, the tax service is as strong as never, and there is a disbalance between the power and knowledge of the tax service and the taxpayers. They're ready to play, understanding current rules, but transfer of the administration of social charges, the old cases of the VAT, the tax service looks at all of this, and well, it makes claims they have panicking attitude. So we should adjust the speed of whitening, because we have no other taxpayers within the subjects of the Russian Federation. We don't have any other business. This business is there. We should give it time to be adjusted to the new realities. Tax service understands this. In the field, they don't quite understand. And what Maxim said about, he said that power from the God and business from God. You rephrased me too much. That's first group of questions. Second group of questions. This standpoint of the Russian Union of the Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. In an hour, it will be ascribed to the Perm region. Another point I'd like to make, and I'd like to draw attention to, the implied taxation. Andrei Mikhailovich spoke about the sales tax. I think the project was successful. Prior to this was a successful project. Patents for migrants also implied taxation based on de facto system. I think we should continue these things for the legalization of the small businesses, for self-employed and so on. Going to the self-employed and understanding big discussion. I think there was one mistake made. We decided on one scheme and written to the tax code and tried to implement. Let's go back to the pilot projects and give the subjects of the federation independency. Let's offer 2 or 3 schemes, such as and the recreation tax and sales tax, and there were some successful attempts. We should go to the better flexibility in the tax policy in relation to small businesses and give the regions opportunity to realize different models. Now about center and the regions, I'd like to ask to comply with the agreements such as the movable property on one side, not the worst variant, but still not something that was promised. If we agree, yes, provinces behaved not the way we expected. We expected that everyone rush and establish the benefits for the movable property. It is balanced now, and there are many liabilities. So the takeaway to right, I think that was not so good example. So we have to learn lesson. Another point, Andrei Mikhailovich touched the subject of equalization of the inter-regional and the tax policy. We should not give the tax policy job to equalize the regions. Even more so, we have imperative of equalization. In my point of view, it's present in the inter-budget relationship. We spoke much about this. So inequality is resource for development. Seems an important point for me. What else? About tax benefits. Anton Germanovich didn't say, but we feel the breath of Ministry of Finance and the strong hand of analysis of efficiency of the tax benefits. Yes, it is a topic that we have to go back to. It's not an increase of the tax burden, but should look at the efficiency of the tax benefits. And going back to the key question, change or not to change, my position is we should very carefully change anything and should not make changes if they're not forced, and I'll explain why. The problem is not tax system, the problem is efficiency of the budget expenses. For the same money, we can gain absolutely different level of the social services and absolutely different level of efficiency of the spending. If we change tax system, the focus will go back to all these changes. So it seems to me, if we do it pointedly, to, this attitude towards the changes and the proposals I made, the key objective is the logics of budget spending. Alexander Sergeyevich, may I ask a question? Can you mention, based on the system of change of the tax system, a discussion about changeability on stability remains? If you change, can you tell about two changes that are the most crucial in terms of the small business? Or yet we don't touch? Yes, we have proposal in terms of adjustment of the tax system. First of all, I'd like to say your key question, whether tax burden is growing or not. It, for micro business, one of the best tax system in the world, in this country. 2 million euros with turnover in a year. They pay 6%, even less. The credit is social payments, and the tax service registers 20 times less. Not many places in the world like this. So the composition of the micro, I emphasize micro business, is according to the best Asian or European practices. We have 6 million micro businesses, and it feels great within this tax system. But what should be changed? We have 6 million of the micro businesses at the same time, according to different assessments. 10 million or 14 million citizens make entrepreneurship on the regular basis, and they work in the shadows. These are so-called self-employed. This is a big question. Why? The legal business asks the question, why I'm paying maybe not high taxes and my neighbor is not paying anything. The audit doesn't visit him at all, and he participates in the bad faith competition in the market that we all possess. This question should be resolved by self-employed and about illegal business. We believe, for instance, that 171 article of the criminal code should be lifted. It's not efficient. Running after illegals is not the police job. Instead, enhance the administrative liability. This can be done by the provinces, where the taxes go from the small businesses, the first block, and have concrete proposals how to widen illegal business. The second point, what I wanted to say, is the cadastre assessments of the real estate. Since 16th year, people started to pay new taxes. Let's compute. We should move. My first education is cybernetics, the most primitive. The hallmarks, we go against hallmarks. For instance, 2% of the property tax introduced by the provinces. Why 2? We have 1,000 square meters convenience stores with about 200,000 per meter. The business is supposed to pay 4 million with maximum rate. Why in the provinces they don't compute? They introduced 2%. So we spoke to Ulyanov's governor. When we outlined everything, he made it 0.75. Moscow refused from 2%. It made 1.4. Moscow province computed, decided not to make 2%. It made 1.5, for instance. When we talk about implied taxes, this is what governor of the Perm territory said. We'll introduce sales tax. Numbers were 3 times higher, and Andrei Mikhailovich made this discussion public, and the numbers were the way they are. No commotion. The same is about cadastre assessed real estate tax. When people start paying in 3 years, so the best ally of the Duma members and the government, implied taxes, we need to compute 100 times and cut just one time, and this is what we believe must be done in terms of the adjustment of the tax code. Concluding words from you, Mikhail Yurievich Orlov, Chairman of the Expert Council of the Council of Duma. We started from saying that President last year said that there's necessary to tune the tax system so it stimulates the business. But I forgot to ask business, what does business need to stimulate it, and what does business expect from taxes? I can say that last year was an interesting experiment conducted at the State Duma facility when the congressman decided to create working group to make opportunity to make proposals. Interesting result, quite bulky, volumetric, and I think they'll be demanded, but all proposals can be condensed to 3 points. Stability of the tax system. And stability is not conservation of the existing problems, but stability of the taxation. Andrei Mikhailovich stated today that oftentimes the changes are made. On the 27th of November of the last year, President signed and it was published 16 tax laws in one day. They'll be enforced since 1st of January of this year. The taxpayer discovered new game rules. This is the problem of stability that should be solved. Second is direct action law. This year we celebrate 20 years of the first part of the tax code, and tax code was based on direct action principle, and legislators should regulate all the tax issues. Even more so, there is a 4th article of the tax code that says but exclusion when the executive power can regulate tax issues. Today, only as for the first part of the tax code, we have 11 references to the governmental acts that should regulate the taxation, 20 references to the acts of the Ministry of Finance, and 94 references to the acts of the Federal Tax Service. Factually, today, even going back to the system of the 90s, when all issues of taxation were solved based on instructions of the State Tax Service of the Russian Federation, the law loses its direct action nature. Next, if we talk about stability, the question was raised about non-tax payments. I will not repeat that the non-tax payments must not be collected within the framework of the tax code. I'd like to say that the instrument of resolution, I think it's a nonsense to make a law about non-tax payment. I'll give you an analogy. You have a wonderful law about tax bodies of the Russian Federation since 1991. It's written that tax bodies should conduct tax control. It's not a secret that many other state bodies claim the same rights. But no one thinks about writing separate law about non-tax bodies of the Russian Federation. That includes one line. No one can act on behalf of the tax service, so have to solve the issue with the non-tax payments. Whether they are not there, we cannot rely on position of the Constitutional Court. In 98, when we wrote tax code, we had position of the Constitutional Court, and we relied on this. In the Constitutional Court, they forget about this, but all the issues with how to collect taxes should be decided as the law in application of the law. And the second question raised by the businesses, reasonable tax control. What does it need? The quality of change of the tax control within the last 5-7 years, unquestionably. Let's introduce new instrument of control. Let's forget about archaic system of the tax control. If you look at 165 article of the tax code that says how to justify zero rate of taxation, this article was created in 2000. The key document supplied to the tax body, because tax body couldn't know whether export is real. Now we have instruments. Why do we need such a complex control introduction of new tax control should certainly lead to dying out of the obsolete tax control system used in 90s and 2000 years. And the third is fine-tuning of the tax system. As for the certain taxes, business offered to correct the norm in such a way that we can meet the rules that are established by the legislators. It has to do with things such as the movable property, the benefit, whether they act or not act. Say simply whether it's moving property, is it subject to the taxation or not? And if it does, what's the order of taxation? Should simplify the system of regulation, so we have to understand.
Let me tell you right now, though perhaps it was not the right audience on the budget committee that were raised the quite revolutionary issues regarding the tax reform, but no one offered to cancel profit tax or increase VAT, but they were talking about the fine-tuning of the taxes. So talking about stability, let's not substitute stability with conservation. So we do have quite a lot of problems that we can deal with today, so we need to implement them somehow. Dear colleagues, thank you very much. Summing up the results, I'm not going to sum up, actually. I would like to ask the panelists next to me to probably to say a few words in closing and to provide their feedback. Anton Silana first. Dear colleagues, the key questions that require further discussions that we need to deal with right now during the first half of this year have already been approved. The questions of fine-tuning and the relevant legislative decisions. So that's why I would like to say that the taxes are a tool of the economic policy. So right now we are making adjustments to the taxation system in such a way so that we could deal with the key tasks. First of all, the task of the economic growth, the task of filling up the budget, technological task, simplifying the system for taxpayers, as it was mentioned here, that the tax payment system should be as comfortable as possible for businesses, and that's what we're going to do further on. I quite agree that we have to make adjustments to our tax system in such a manner so that during the next 6 years it should not there will be no need to change it radically. So we will definitely make adjustments during the spring session of our parliament so as to prepare our vision of the budget. Well, of course, we cannot discuss incessantly the tax code amendments, keeping up tensions for the business, but on the other hand, we need to provide certain answers what we are going to do in this area. During this period, prior to making any amendments, we will talk additionally, we'll discuss these things with the businesses. We already had such discussions, held such discussions with business representatives about tax innovations, so we'll be holding several more meetings with businessmen. So our logic is quite clear in this sense. We will definitely clarify our tax position further on without increasing the tax burden and preserving on the whole the tax system for the next 6-year cycle so as not to make any radical changes. It should be predictable, comprehensible, and should meet all modern requirements, including in the context of competition on the world market. Andrei Mikhailovich, there were 10 or 11 points in your presentation. But based on the results of this discussion, do you have, do you want to say something more, to add something? Or probably to remove something? So the one point is about re-establishment of trust, which did not exist before. So you can omit that. You can skip that point. But today the situation is somewhat changed because the businesses, on the one hand, the Minister of Finance, on the other hand, so we were on the different sides of this barricade, I would say. But I would like to say that I would like to say thanks to most people here. It's quite realistic to act now in concert, because we have witnessed how the business attitude has changed, and the tax bodies has always been our allies. So it's quite important. But the only thing I wanted to specifically emphasize 3 points. Is one of them raised by Alexander Shokin when he said about the references to 16 tax laws, but in fact, during the spring session, 34 tax laws have been enacted during that session, the spring session, I mean. So I think it's quite important. Whatever we say about the predictability, I think that's possibly we need to exclude the possibility of suspending the norm that the tax laws should be enacted at least 1 month before the budget decision, before the budget is submitted to the Duma. Because unless it is submitted and approved during the autumn session, it will not work next year. So let's stop this practice when during the year we have to kick around the same article and making all the amendments. So let's announce there will be one day, the so-called Uri's day, or maybe 2 days when we can make these amendments in our tax practices. So I think that's what's been quite important. So it's probably will share in the general position here. And there are also 2 more points which I think are quite important. If you remember the amendments in the criminal code, that the criminal case cannot be filed without the permission of the tax body, of the tax office. I think that was probably right. But the fact that the criminal case cannot be directed, forwarded to court without the proper validation, without the proper inspection of the tax body. So no expert study can substitute the tax validation. So I think that should become the real norm, the real standard of the law. We are saying that a person can refer to the prosecutor general or ombudsman, but we would like to say that a certain criminal case cannot be forwarded to court unless there is a permit from the tax body. And finally, the idea that was pronounced here, so what I'm quite concerned about, that's that we have to move away from the flat tax scale. I don't think we should do this. I think that's the main achievement of the tax system in the Russian Federation, making it relatively competitive with regard to other tax systems. Even the fact of discussion whether we should part with the flat scale makes a considerable damage to the tax system of the country. I think that's a kind of a point on the program that we have to be quite clear about this. Both our State Duma, businesses, and the authority are categorically opposed to that. And just want to thank you for not beating me up and for my protracted speech. I would like to subscribe to the previous point mentioned by Andrei Makarov. I think it was really good that the system of personal income tax was not raised here because it's quite simple. The flat tax is not a problem to collect tax. We can collect anything. I think that's a political problem. I think that's precisely so because it is right and is fair. Summing up the results of this session, I would like to say that we do not have many working institutions. Indeed, we have many institutions, but not many of them are really working institutions. The tax system is an institution that is really working, and it has become a working organization just as we witnessed its development. So I think that's really the result of the efforts made by all those who have got together in this room and all those who are talking here today. These are the people who made this tax system as it is today. So thanks a lot to you for that, and thank you for the debate.